Hello all and welcome back to Reddit Inside It. Today we're going back into the story. Dan's lawyer pulled some strings to get the divorce started as fast as possible, but it cost him. I don't know the more specific details or how much it all cost. They never told me. Sister-in-law, on the other hand, was financially backed into a corner very badly. You know what happens when you corner an animal. She fought back, but the law was not on her side, nor was her dwindling finances. Sister-in-law's parents had to pay for a lawyer for her. Not a very good one either. Also, she actually brought her affair partner to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was a real piece of work. He had a bronze tongue and charming smile he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed sister-in-law had been wronged by an incompetent husband, which is why she sought the arms of another man. He claimed he was ready to take responsibility for his child he had fathered with sister-in-law, but that sister-in-law would still be needing the alimony for helping support herself and care for said child. He remarked that because Dan at the time was still on the birth certificate, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan said this guy used big words and a charming smile, but seemed an extra special kind of stupid, and coming from Dan, that's saying something. The judge was also not swayed in the slightest, and told the bronze-tongued dude that he was a hypocrite for saying he was ready to take responsibility for his own child, while also holding his hand out for money from the man whose marriage he helped ruin. That shut him up. Dan was prepared to sue his wife's affair partner for alienation of affection too. However, that fell through. I guess it would have been on Dan to prove how much she'd loved him before the affair started. But after her mask came off and we saw the real her, we're not sure if she ever really loved him at all, or if she just loved having a meal ticket. Someone here pointed out that sister-in-law probably kept popping out kids to avoid getting a job, and you may have been right. Either way, sister-in-law tried dragging out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge kept that from happening much. I swear Dan must have seriously lucked out because he got one of the meanest and most unsympathetic to cheaters judges in the state, and all the evidence we had on sister-in-law made it easy to keep her from playing the victim. So instead, she just let her real female doggy self out since there was no point in hiding it anymore. The court had all records provided by Dan and myself, police reports, photos, and recordings to prove she was an abusive narcissist. There was a mountain of evidence against sister-in-law that she had no way to climb out or hike around. She tried standing against the mountain, but that was prime avalanche territory. In the end of the divorce, sister-in-law struck a deal to end things quick. Dan takes 3/4 of the credit card debt, gets his name off the affair baby's birth certificate, and sister-in-law walked away with only partial custody of her children, alimony, but also most of the credit card debts she racked up. Her being legally employed by her parents meant she had an income of her own to fall back on to start paying off her debt. She can see her other kids almost whenever she wants and can take them on weekends, but for whatever reason she has made very few attempts to see them. She took them out to eat fast food a couple times, but never took them home with her. The kids are back in school now, so that gives her even less opportunities to see them. You'd think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They barely saw Dan's children before that too. Now, they may not even bother to see them at all. Do they hate kids or something? Even Dan doesn't know, but he tells him that his in-laws were always indifferent to him. As for Dan, well, he really did love his life a lot, so the betrayal of her cheating made him hit the bottle hard. Rewind back to the night of the confrontation with his wife. He came back to me in a stupor with a whiskey bottle in hand, his face all scratched up and covered in bandages. I wouldn't say he was drunk yet, but I freaked out seeing him like that at first. Then berated him for driving under the influence, but didn't mean much compared to the betrayal of his cheating harlot of a soon-to-be ex-wife. We spent a few hours hanging out in my camper as to not disturb my tenants. All the while, Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying now he's a fool, and how he regretted ever marrying sister-in-law. Pretty much anytime he mentions her now, he just refers to her as that female dog, so that's ex-sister-in-law's nickname now. Ironically, this time together was the most bonding Dan and I have done in 15 years. While he didn't exactly apologize to me, he called himself a crappy human being with terrible taste in women, then said I at least his mistakes. Despite all he previously did to me, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't risk letting him try to drive home. So I told him to stay the night and managed to take his keys, then set up a bunk in my camper for him to use. I rented out my spare rooms after all. He was in no shape to drive home, and if he'd taken an Uber, he'd have to pay for it, then have to come back for his car later. He was still a depressed, crying mess, and I didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that, and frankly, I was worried he'd do something insanely stupid if I let him leave. I didn't want him to sleep in the house, so putting him in the camper was the best option. Just because that female dog screwed him over doesn't mean I suddenly trusted him, so better for him to sleep it off in the camper. We both spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker was no fun with two people, and Old Maid was just boring. Thankfully, I had an Uno deck too, and an old school battleship game. He really liked those. It was enough to keep him distracted until he was finally willing to lay down after running out of whiskey. He threw up a lot in a bucket anyways, but he was not opposed to sleeping in my camper. In fact, he found the idea kinda cool. Dan had a lot of questions for me as how I'd lived in the camper for as long as I did. I answered them all, if not just to keep him busy, but I needed to go to bed myself since I needed to be up early. So I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies. That way he could amuse himself alone for a while if he managed to stay awake. Before leaving for work in the morning, I popped in while Dan was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen and an energy drink on the counter of the camper's kitchenette, along with his car keys and a letter explaining to leave through the backyard gate. He saw himself out without trouble around 1:30 p.m. About a month after ex-sister-in-law was kicked out, Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he found it to be more comfortable than I'd thought when he slept in it, and he fully admitted he didn't ask sooner out of pride. But with his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the house, he decided to give up his room for the eldest kid. He's got 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest and now 8 years old. The kids were forced to share a room up until that point, and they just had curtains up for the boys' half of the room. But the boy often slept on the couch to avoid his sister. I knew the poor kid was really desperate for his own room, so I guess Dan decided to finally make a better decision as a dad and came to see me in order to beg to borrow my camper so his son could have his room. If he could have afforded it, he'd have bought his own camper instead of relying on me. And he even said as much. I hadn't even gotten the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I let him use it since it was actually for a good cause, and he promised to buy his own in time anyway. No, I didn't ask for rent money for the camper. Dan is in enough of a financial hole as it is right now. Ex-sister-in-law and the divorce strained him. And I've learned that I get far better results with family lately by not being spiteful. I loaded my camper up and put it down in my parents' backyard, and my father put in a 30-amp breaker so it'll have enough power for Dan to run heat and AC when he needs it. I do miss the camper after all that time living in it. It kind of felt like a part of me, but the only reason I loaned it out was for the sake of Dan's kid. Pretty much the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan is for the sake of those kids, as I've bonded with them. And yes, I know I may not get the camper back for quite some time, and it's likely not in the kind of condition I lent it out in, but I've warned Dan and my parents that they'll be financially responsible for any damage they do to the camper, as well as its upkeep for as long as they have it. I also took many timestamp pictures and video of the camper inside and outside before lending it out so I can prove its condition before it left. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to my terms, so that's as good as a contract. With the financial drain of the divorce, Dan's not going to be able to get a place of his own for years, I'll bet. Though he seems to have no complaints about living in the camper, at least. I don't know if he actually likes it or if he's just putting up a front, but I can guess it reminds him of the backyard forts we had as kids, because that's how it felt sometimes. Either way, he's living in it now. I did get some major props from the extended family for letting him borrow it too. I'm being referred to by a lot of them as the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. Either way, I think getting rid of sister-in-law was a great first step in mending the family as a whole. I still have little care for my brother and parents after the way they treated me all my life, but I'm not gonna let Dan's kids suffer for it. Those kids have actually really warmed up to me. Now they're happy to see me when I come over or when they visit me. I've even babysat a few times. Now that they don't have their mother's toxic around, they've become much nicer kids, especially to me. I'm getting to enjoy being an uncle now. My mother is still doing the bulk of the parenting for my nibblings, and she's been acting as nice as possible to stay on my good side. My father often looks defeated in my presence, but otherwise has been either stoically quiet or just generally nice to me, but he won't talk to me much. Though that's leagues better than how he was before, at least. I'm not letting my guard down either way. My parents do seem more happy that my ex-sister-in-law is gone, and they often say they don't know what they ever saw in her, my mom especially, because the two of them butted heads over who was the mom in the house for the longest time. Now for the last part. At the same time as the divorce, Dan sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate from the baby that wasn't his. Ex-sister-in-law really didn't want to change it because it meant no more child support from Dan if she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh in case it turned out he wasn't the father either, but he was. Dan's lawyer had a long talk with ex-sister-in-law. Ex-sister-in-law had no leg to stand on, and Dan was ready to go to bat to make her situation worse. She didn't have the finances to fight him any longer and agreed to changing the birth certificate. The Bronx-tongued dude who'd knocked her up did take financial responsibility as a parent, but he ended up not staying with sister-in-law. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to tell him that he'd broken up with ex-sister-in-law and that he wouldn't bother him again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan linked me to it. And that guy was upset now that he's financially responsible for a child he never planned to have, and that he's too young for this. Guys, from what Dan's lawyer was able to find out, that man is just over 40. He looks younger than he is. But he's by no means a young man. Shortly after that, he put his online profile on private. Ex-sister-in-law did the same with hers a long time prior. But I've no more information left to give. Oh, trust me, that is not true. I don't mean that rudely, it's just like there is more. On to update number 7. No surprise, ex-sister-in-law saw my Reddit post. She can't contact me about them in any way, but with the lawyer, thanks to my restraining order against her, she likely can't afford to get a lawyer right now anyway. Since the divorce financially drained her too, so she complained to Dan about it and demanded he tell me to delete my Reddit account. But not only has Dan read my recent posts, he no longer cares. He said they serve as a reminder of the jerk he used to be, and he's not losing sleep about it. Besides, I still helped him out despite all he's done to me, so he's not going to be upset about it. Parents have also made sure to treat Dan and I more equally when I'm around too. My father is still a man of few words around me, though. Someone pointed out that changing now after so long of treating me the opposite of Dan means he doesn't know how to connect with me anymore, and I think they're right. I don't mind the way he is now, though. My mother has developed the habit of saying she's sorry about every little thing in my presence. Dan told me she and my father have been reamed a lot by extended family and their counselor, and now my mom feels like she needs to apologize for everything. This is a stark contrast to how they used to treat me. Also, I didn't talk about before on what ex-sister-in-law's opinion was on Dan borrowing my camper so his son could have his and ex-sister-in-law's old bedroom. Well, like a stereotypical bully, she looked down on him and mocked him about it because now he's living like a bum, as she put it, but Dan took it all in stride and asked if she was done yet because he knew exactly this was how she'd react, and he just plain doesn't care anymore. She's borderline dead to him, and her insults were on deaf ears. Then he pointed out to her that he was living out of the camper because he was putting his kids ahead of himself so his son could have his own room, something his ex never did despite being their mother. She just weaponized her children in pregnancy to keep from working and to emotionally blackmail everyone. Then he asked her to remind him how that was working out for her. Mind you, this was early on in their divorce. I'm sure you can all guess her reaction. Dan said his ex did have quite the tantrum about my recent post, but no one has bothered to contact me on her behalf to take them down, so she just has to live with the well-deserved shame. She has also been trying to act nicer to Dan lately. Guess the grass isn't so green living with her parents. Dan tolerates her as the mother of her children whenever they meet, but nothing more. He will never take her back. He told me that he can never look at her like he used to, and the very thought of her turns him off emotionally, so ex-sister-in-law pretty much has no chance of reconciliation. I have no new info on ex-sister-in-law's affair partner. His social media is still locked down. Same with ex-sister-in-laws. And it's like to remain that way as long as I have a chance of reading them. Update number 8. My truck got egged on Halloween. Happened in the middle of the night, very early morning on the 1st. I suspect it was my ex-sister-in-law, but the person my cameras recorded was wearing layers of heavy sweat, had their face wrapped up along with big glasses covering their eyes. I really couldn't tell if they were a man or a woman. They came on foot too, so no identifying a car. They did look about ex-sister-in-law's height though, but that's not much in the way of evidence on its own. If it was ex-sister-in-law, she knew about my cameras, so covering her face and body for a pretty eggy revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in years. Way to finally put her college degree to use by egging a beat-up old pick-em-up truck. The egger showed up around 3 a.m. I was deep asleep and didn't hear anything. Whoever it was that appeared that night quickly threw a dozen or eggs or so all over my truck. They didn't attempt to do any more damage at least, and were gone in a flash as soon as the last egg was thrown. I didn't see the mess until leaving for work in the morning. I ran my truck through a local car wash during my lunch break. That took most of the eggs off. Had to scrub it a bit more later after work. Egg really isn't good for the paint, but a truck from the 90s doesn't exactly look mint anyway. I did take photos and filed a police report with the CCTV footage as evidence, but nothing so far has come of it. There was no real damage other than my minor irritation and a $15 at a car wash. If ex-sister-in-law did do this, she wouldn't be smart enough to not only throw eggs and not keep my paint or slash my tires, so my insurance wouldn't be involved. But I don't think much will come of the police report, as the cops seem to dismiss it, as it is a probable prank by a teenager. They were probably overworked, but at least the report short, we'll keep a paper trail in case of future incidences. I waited until now to post because I wondered if anything else would happen, but no, just back to peace and quiet. I would appreciate any good advice on the matter though, just in case something else like this happens again. Date. I asked around with some people in the street about cameras, possibly seeing the person who egged my cars. I got responses ranging from "we don't have cameras" to "it was Halloween, people pull stupid pranks, let it go." The few people who were helpful told me that I waited way too long to ask and the footage auto-deleted. So basically the egger got away. But if it was sister-in-law, I'm guessing she had to walk around half a mile in those sweats just not to get her car spotted on camera or something. It wouldn't surprise me if she questioned if it was worth the effort. Oh well, I guess I'll just wait and see if the egger comes back next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the egger though, and stapled a few up on posts. So now people in my neighborhood are aware at least. The tenants renting out the 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it, and I really don't blame them. It's not their problem. And that marks the end of this saga. Yes, finally the end. It's gone on a lot. So all commentary for all 4 parts is in this video, and that's what this is going to be now. For the first part, I just want to say, man, I feel really bad for OP, and that he had to deal with that. I'm glad that his brother and sister-in-law are no longer together. I think a really good subreddit for the OP to be checking out might be r/raised-by-narcissist support sub, so it might help. I'm also glad that his family got back together and like are nice with each other. I do realize this story does seem a little bit crazy to be true, but it is possible. Yeah, but that's it. Have a good one, y'all.